Good morning. My name is Bert Jackson, and I'm president of the Cape Cod Technology Council. The Tech Council is an organization that provides leadership and advisory services for the Cape entrepreneurship, education community, and also we are a watchdog for technology infrastructure here on Cape Cod, which is why what we're talking about today is of vital interest to us. We're kicking off a very important event to address something that's going to affect each of us, not only individually, but also in our businesses and as a community and as a region. Development of a smart grid, or grid modernization as Eversource calls it, is a step into the future. For those of us in the technology world, this is developing a new interactive platform for what has been a mechanical industrial model for generating and using electricity that was developed in the 19th and early 20th century. So we're dealing with a distribution technology that's about 100 years old. And the fact is that we have a world where new technologies are coming at us. And one of the great examples of that here is Open Cape, where we now have world-class middle-mile broadband infrastructure here on Cape Cod, which gives us the opportunity to expand on that. And we need a power grid that's going to match that kind of technology. It's vital our community learns about this to help shape what it means for our homes and our business and our regional economy. We're going to hear today about the big picture context of opportunities and challenges from Carl Rubago, a former U.S. Department of Energy official, and from Austin Brandt, who has done some presentations for the Tech Council. He's a brilliant young fellow of the Cape Light Compact. We'll hear some specific concerns and questions with the $496 million grid modernization plan that Eversource has submitted to the Department of Public Utilities. I just want to say that the impact of what we're talking about here today is generational. This is something that is going to impact what's happening in our community, not just for the next 5 or 10 years, but for our children and for our grandchildren. So I'd like to start off, I'd like to introduce Maggie Downey, who's the administrator for the Cape Light Compact, and she's going to give you a little more perspective on all the speakers. Thank you.
So good morning. Thank you for bearing with us as we work through these technical glitches. What I do want to do is take a moment to introduce Carl. The Cape Light Compact is very pleased to be partnering with the Cape Tech Council to explore and investigate the Eversource Grid Mod Plan. The purpose of our partnership and what we hope to achieve is to have a local community dialogue on the plan and really engage what we consider key stakeholders here on the Cape and Vineyard about what do we want to see in a modern grid. This should be no surprise, but we will pay for the grid modernization. We will pay for all aspects of it, and we believe that as a result, we should be actively engaged in identifying what we want to see and how much we want to pay for this. So I'd like to just we have today with us Carl Rubago and his presentation. Carl is the executive director of the Pace Energy and Climate Center at Pace Law School in White Plains, New York. The PEC mission is to protect the Earth's environment through solutions that transform the ways that society supplies and consumes energy. Carl has over 25 years' experience in energy and climate policy markets. He serves as the chair of the board of the Center for Resource Solutions, a San Francisco-based non-governmental organization that works to advance voluntary clean energy markets. He also sits on the board of the Interstate Renewable Energy Council. He is co-director and principal investigator for the Northeast Solar Energy Market Coalition, a U.S. DOE Sunshot Initiative. His past experience includes a commissioner of the Texas Public Utility Commission, deputy assistant secretary at the U.S. Department of Energy, vice president of Distributed Energy Resources at Austin Energy, director of regulatory affairs at AES Corporation and AES Wind, and managing director and principal of the Rocky Mountain Institute. He is a graduate of Texas A&M University with a Bachelor of Business Administration degree in Business Management. Carl is an attorney with a postdoctorate degrees in environmental law and military law. a veteran of more than 12 years in the U.S. Army he served as the Armored Cavalry officer, and he's a member of the Judge Advocates General Corps and is an airborne ranger qualified. He brings to you today a wealth of background, and I am very honored and pleased to introduce him for his presentation. So please welcome Carl.
The most important thing for you to understand is the electric distribution grid is a one-way flow system from big to little. And that's a historical concept, and it's a legacy of a history that goes back to the time when central station power plants were the most economically efficient way to make lots of electricity, and in which we had set up a regulatory apparatus to encourage utilities to make investments not only in those central station power plants, but also in the net transmission and distribution networks necessary to get their electricity to customers. It was originally and always supposed to be a service arrangement, and you can see this in backwards. It always was supposed to be a service arrangement, but in the last several decades, it's been increasingly focused on the commoditization of electricity. So anyway, what I'm trying to show here in the big block in the middle, this is a standard GE slide of grid modernization. And if you look, you don't have to get all the words and all the details. What you can really see is that it goes from a centralized control operations at the left through other aspects of the operations, moving to the right, and there hanging off the end of the system are some little squares which are houses. This is the standard conceptualization of the electric utility industry, from big to little, control at the central level, and customers dangling off the end of it, needing to ultimately be served. The icons, the pictures that you see on your right, however, are what is coming along and has to come along in order for us to make a true energy transformation that is sustainable today and tomorrow. Ideas like distributed generation, rooftop solar, commercial solar, electric vehicles connected to electric energy management systems and home storage systems, and finally, larger storage systems embedded in the distribution grid. The old utility ran on a number of old concepts, but if you have the old utility in mind and you approach grid modernization, you will come up with three principles, and Austin will tell you about how Eversource has these in its filing. First, there is a tendency and urge to gold plate. It's a legacy of the old central station model that because utilities only make a profit on their capital investment, they tend to spend more than they need to. And they want to spend their money, not your money. So their investment is what profits them, and they have an urge to gold plate the system. So one of the things you got to look out for is whether or not the proposal in this case is for gold plating the grid without getting reasonable value for it. Second, there's this idea of waiting for customers, waiting for you to come up with what you want from a modern grid, because that's all you spend your day doing every day is thinking about what the modern grid should do, right? It becomes a convenient kind of excuse to say, well, customers are not asking for these things, so why should we do them? When we actually don't know what to ask for and need a little bit of leadership. In no other marketplace would a competitive provider wait for us to come up with the ideas, but that's exactly how it works. And then I already mentioned utility control. So let's go to the next slide. What I'm trying to do with this picture is show the contrast. At the top is the sort of top to bottom, left to right flow, big to little. And and those icons that I showed you on the right of the new technologies that need to be integrated. And the arrows change. Instead of one-way flows, all the arrows can go both ways. Customers can participate in selling not just back to the grid, but actually having transactions with their customers themselves. Instead of being on a long, skinny pipeline, we are actually part of a meshed system. We're embedded in a grid together. We're an ecosystem together, interdependent. And it's realized by that lower picture there of the black thing with the guy's finger on it. That's a home display system on a little iPad type device that can tell you, I had to find one, I could only find one with British numbers on it with pounds. There are a lot fewer pounds now. But to give the customer the opportunity to get a sensing from that smart meter device about how their energy use is going and what their budget's like and what their devices are doing. And it's absolutely critical to think that to be part of this mesh energy system, what's going to happen is we're going to be much more involved with our energy use. We're going to have the option to see it. Right now, your meter is somewhere around the corner of your house, and it's not a big part of your life. When the utility installs a meter, they use it to read to bill. But if connected to this kind of customer interface, it gives you the opportunity to actually interact. And so we have new concepts emerging. Concepts like, first of all, the utility ought to engage in Smart Grid 1.0, and meaning it ought to just bring itself into the modern era, catch up with the 12-year-olds. Second, it ought to start exploring those customer interfaces in Smart Grid 2.0 that allow us to control our devices, our consumption, and manage our energy. Customers are no longer just consumers or producers. We're now this new thing called prosumers, in which we interact in a constant and iterative basis with the grid around us. We start thinking about the grid not as one rigid structure from top to bottom, but little ecological niches of electric service that can be islanded, can operate independently for resilience purposes, or can optimize behavior within subsets of the grid by interacting between customers. And increasingly, as all the technology at the distributed end of the system becomes more affordable, we in fact can choose to defect from the grid, from the tyranny of the monopoly, and exercise some economic defection in which we take responsibility and manage our own energy bills. That's what's possible if we integrate those technologies on the right with the intelligence of a smart grid deployed in a way that enables and empowers us. Okay, so let me make it clear that on the smart meter, there can be no customer interface. Both are needed, but you can't get to that sophisticated control without the meter. So let's go to the next slide. What I want to do is talk a little bit about the big picture here and tell you what utilities are facing as an industry and what we're seeing around the country. Flip it again for me. All right. One of the best ways that I've found to sort of understand this is the concept of the company store. I don't know how many of you sort of remember this from history, but once upon a time, you know, coal companies were trying to completely monopolize production around the coal plant, as well as monopolize and control the labor. So they came up with this really clever idea that if you wanted to buy anything, food or groceries or anything else, you could actually get them from the company stores. Not only would the coal company own your paycheck, they would collect your paycheck at the company store and provide you a limited set of options. It's kind of quaint now. We think about it, you know, a lot of them are museums, if they still exist, or Cracker Barrel restaurants. But, you know, we think of them as being a quaint part of Americana. But in reality, they were a sophisticated means of economic control over labor and over local economies. They meant that you might have had choices, but the only choices were the ones the company decided to stock on the shelves. And all that silliness about growing your own vegetables, well, that just took time away from time you could spend in the coal mine, right? It's an antiquated idea, and just as the coal companies are increasingly going bankrupt across this country and coal power plants are shutting down for economic as well as environmental reasons, but mostly economic reasons, change is coming. Go to the next slide for me. And you should see drivers of change. There's a whole lot of stuff going on in the electric utility industry. I'm not going to go through all of these. The big issues, the big thing for you to remember is that utility businesses are economic and financial machines. As I told you before, they live to invest capital, to make a return on that capital, return it to shareholders. They grow bigger in order to be more profitable. They profit in order to grow bigger. But all of that is changing. Fuel prices are low with natural gas, like it or not. The central station power plant system doesn't work anymore. They're accountable to new drivers like customer preferences, environmental requirements. And then we've got changes even going on between the states and the federal authority as our markets become more integrated across the country. Some utilities are exploring this new reality with a quest for transformation. Some feel it is a force of disruption. But this is the time for some kind of change. Go to the next slide. What's driving it for our purposes most significantly is a category of resources we call distributed energy resources. There are those things I showed you before, the batteries and the electric vehicles that can go two ways to the grid, and the solar panels and the small turbines and the energy management systems and the customer interfaces, all of which can enable us to participate in our energy destiny. They are small, they are right-sized, they require just the right amount of capital, and much of it is contributed by customers like you. So they don't require rate increases every single time they come along. They can rely on local fuels, some of which never need to be replenished and never vary in price, like wind and solar and biogas, for example, from landfills. They have a higher job per megawatt value, so the more distributed your energy system is, the more local jobs you would have. There's this wonderful symmetry between solar installation and Army and military veterans that we celebrate now every 2 months with a new graduating class up in Fort Drum. They are good for the tax base, and they generate economic development benefits as well. And if we engage them and embed them in the system and take advantage of them, go to the next slide, we can start imagining a world, I said that too glibly. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. We can start imagining a world in which all these resources operate in an integrated grid, regardless of whether it is an urban geography or a more suburban or, say a Cape geography. Go to the next slide. In the face of all this change, utilities can respond in any number of ways. In some parts of the country, they just say we're going to maintain the status quo and harden our resistance and our economic resolve. In other places, they're taking incremental changes, which is what I believe you'll see proposed in the Eversource proposal. In places like New York, we've decided to take it all on with systemic reform and transformation through something called the New York Reforming the Energy Vision process, as Rhode Island is also doing with its Utility of the Future docket 4600. Maryland's about to start with its Utility of the Future process. And then the last choice, and God help us all if it gets to this, is legislative overhaul. It is a matter of how and when, not a matter of if. In response to that, next slide, some of us have sort of started writing down ideas. There's a lot of words here. I'll just give you the main point. One of the ideas that sort of characterizes the New York process is what I call the sharing utility. And it's an idea that applies to the utility industry, what we're beginning to learn in this world of collaborative consumption. Now, you may not know what collaborative consumption is unless you pause and think about it, but you've all been part of some kind of collaborative consumption portion of the economy. If you use any sort of cloud-based web services at all, you're participating in collaborative consumption or a sharing economy. You don't need to own a server in your house. You can actually participate in it just through the internet and buy software as a service, for example, right? We can do the same exact thing in the electric industry, and we think that's a better way for us to engage in the utility. So what's on the table? The old way, which Dave Barry, the humor columnist, once described as, we have electricity, you want it, so shut up. Or the new way, in which we cooperate and collaborate in the production and management of energy services operating in local grids. This is not a hippy-dippy, let's go to Boulder, you've got a hoe, I've got a rake, let's start a garden kind of activity. But it's just as meaningful and powerful as any kind of community collaboration you can imagine. And there are more examples that I provide here. Go to the next slide. What does a sharing utility do? Well, first of all, it allows customers to take advantage of the investments by integrating their technologies, by planning for the best way in which what customers do and what the utilities do can cooperate. It increasingly says we're going to substitute for that capital investment equals profit model to a model where we set performance standards. So the question in the Eversource docket, for example, is not what are you going to do, but what good is it going to do? And how are we going to measure that so we know whether or not you're delivering on the promise of a truly modern grid? And some of the other metrics include things like how does it help maintain prices? How do you achieve our environmental perspectives, reduce our carbon footprint, for example? How do you ensure customer satisfaction, minimize revenue requirement, not just grow it? And then finally, and most importantly for the compact and participants in the compact, it takes advantage of third parties to bring innovation, creativity, and added services. It encourages aggregation in order to make us more powerful together so that when we share, we can share the benefits with the entire grid. Go to the next slide. I've written all this up, so I'm only hitting the high points, but some of the key principles that have to show up as utilities approach these issues are these principles. First, there needs to be honest and full accounting of benefits and costs for every proposed measure, every bit of technology. Not just if we spend money on it, we'll make more profits, or some other metric, but we want to calculate all the benefits and all the costs. I already mentioned performance regulation. Utilities should be rewarded not just for how much they spend, but for what good they do. And we retain cost plus regulation, the old style regulation, only for places where they truly have a monopoly function. Every single day they have to justify their expenses. Instead of thinking about sunk costs as driving their investment model, what they spent yesterday, I put a poll up for you 40 years ago, you're not finished paying for it, thank you very much. I'll keep charging you until you're done. They start thinking about the language of things like creative destruction and transformation within their own business. They start coming up with rate designs that aren't focused on capturing past investments, but encouraging new behaviors. Innovative rate designs like we're trying in other parts of the country that reward you for the value of your activities, whether it's demand response, energy efficiency, conservation, self-generation, or just being a good customer. And then finally, ultimately, the utility becomes a platform for all kinds of innovation. And that's literally what we're calling them in New York, platform providers. So next slide, the old company store can actually be revised, next slide, to start imagining a community store. Cape Light Compact, other efforts where we work together to meet our needs instead of, just going to Walmart for those pasty pink Roma tomatoes that are so terrible and tasteless. Maybe we can do some of our own. And we can start imagining, next slide, that not only are we doing things like, canning and sharing our own vegetables, next click, but we can also start imagining a world in which we're being offered by our utility coupons and incentives to buy a rototiller and grow our own garden and buy seed packets on sale and be part of the energy solution from the bottom up. Go to the next slide. This busy slide shows 12 different things that might show up in a modernized utility. Energy efficiency choices like our HVAC, our lighting, and our appliances that are more efficient or connected to the grid. Load management solutions so that we control the time when we impact the peak. Distributed generation we've already talked about. And dashboard technologies that allow us to see how we're behaving in real time and to make adjustments to suit our personal preferences and our personal budgets. All these ideas and more are being tested in these other proceedings. Next slide. So again, I said that, some of this sharing economy stuff sounds kind of hippy-dippy, but I just did a quick scan of what's going on in other parts of the country that could be, and some are going on here, where you could take advantage of sharing economy concepts in the electric grid, like community and shared solar for people maybe who are renters or have a tree-shaded roof, but still want to participate in local generation. Combined heat and power, cogeneration, like you have operating in schools already. District heating and cooling systems, demand response, receiving a price signal and taking a behavior to reduce your consumption to get a bonus payment because that's when electricity is most expensive. Community choice aggregation, you guys wrote the book on. Rooftop leasing instead of purchasing for people who don't have a lot of cash or borrowing potential. Community storage projects that work just like solar. And finally, vehicles that interact with the grid as mobile storage, not just drawing electricity, but providing services back to the grid as needed and under signal from the distribution grid. Next slide. There are some challenges. This has to work for everyone. There must be equitable access to sustainable energy. It's vital for the political, economic, and social success of any grid modernization effort. We do have to work on getting the right platform technologies in place, that big square that I showed you at the start, but ultimately connected to customers through the smart meter and that customer interface. We need to create and harness the forces of markets in order to encourage third parties, either third-party competitors or customer aggregators like the compact. We need to be not afraid to explore new revenue models, products, and services. Not just wait for customers to ask for them, but actually start experimenting and demonstrating with customers. And then we do have to remember that we are connected to a grid, and that supply must become increasingly renewable. So let's walk through a little bit of a slide, a kind of a build on slides. Next slide. To wrap this up and make way for Austin to talk to you about the grid modernization. So click the slide. Here's the bottom line, okay? The central organizing principle, unfortunately, of what we've created for our kids, what our kids and grandkids are going to have to work on, is climate change. Period. End of story. No dispute, no argument. The facts are in. And there's really only one way out of it. We must go to a 100% renewable energy economy. We can do it. Guys like Mark Jacobson out at Stanford have been modeling this for every single state in the union, as well as for over 100 countries, how you can cost-effectively transition to 100% renewable energy. And let me make it clear, I ran the renewable energy programs for the United States in 1995, and then we had all the technology inventions we needed to be 100% renewable. We are not waiting for some magic secret breakthrough technology that hasn't been invented. Exxon does not have some special technology locked away in a bunker that we need in order to do this. We can do it. It is a matter of will. And it is increasingly a matter of survival. So how do we get there? Click for me. Well, I would say that there are three terms that the new 3 Rs. We need to focus on renewables, we need to focus on resilience, and we need to focus on reinvention. Click again. So I've highlighted that. So how do we do that? Well, remember, keep in mind what's driving things, because as we move forward, click again for me, you need something to keep you on path. Click. Mine is Jonathan and Avery and all the other grandchildren, I hope, that to come. For utilities, I've already listed out several of them. Natural gas prices, and yep, good, the list is up there. Central station economics and the improving economics of distributed energy resources, and active and engaged customers as individuals and as a group. A focus on resiliency, because climate challenges are getting more real every day, and a willingness to experiment with new utility business models. Click again. So what does this reinvention take us? Well, to the sharing utility, I argue. Click again. This summarizes the key points of what the sharing utility has to do. I won't repeat them. Click again. And the features of a well-regulated sharing utility. My key point here, by the way, is that regulators and customers have a role in keeping the utility on track. I promise you that regulators who do not do their job and act as a substitute for the forces of competition, and customers who do not do their job in organizing and articulating their preferences will get run over and will not get the change you need. Next slide. Next click. So how does this all go? Well, it leads to that modern integrated grid, but next slide, you're going to have to ask some questions. Ask questions when you look at this modernization plan, like what function is served by this investment? What vision is served by this plan? And is this moving backward, or is it just an artifice to hold us moving forward, or an artifice for holding us back? Next slide. Keep the challenges in mind as you go forward. Click again. Our future can become all renewable. Click again. If we do two important, click one more time. if we do two important things. First, not the subject of this talk, but vitally important, especially as I drove around yesterday, as I drive around everywhere, we have to electrify transportation. Not just to get us off of petroleum, but because we need that mobile storage everywhere in the grid. Because, you know, remember with cars, we only use them 5% of the time. And 95% of the engine energy goes to moving the car and not the passenger. So when those cars are idle, they need to be an active part of our energy mix, and they can be if they are electric. That is a critical step, and what goes hand in hand with that is what's on the left side there. We need a smarter grid that could take advantage of that and other resources and balance the system for us today and in the future. Last click. Thank you very much for your attention to my fast run through. I hope we'll have time to talk about it more, and thanks again for your patience on the technology. All right, I took you back to that, and you can figure it out.
Thanks.
Good luck. Give me coffee.
Here we go. Can everyone hear me? All right, so Carl did a great job of walking you through what grid modernization could be and what it could look like, and my job is to now tell you what Eversource is proposing. Okay. What we're doing here in the first slide, one over. So, you know, Carl gave a great background on the what and the why, but it's good to run through it one more time. Click again. I'm going to regret adding so much animation to this. As Carl mentioned, our electric grid was really designed to deliver power from central generating stations to the end user. It was a business arrangement. It wasn't interactive. There wasn't really innovation. We had people that needed power, and we had people that could generate power. And so the people that generated power sold the power to the people that needed it, and they gave them a bill once a month. And that was your interaction with the electric grid. And really, it's remained the same. Everyone gets a bill in the mail once a month. They used 600 kilowatt hours, they pay the bill, and then they wait to see what they got next month. So why are we here? Why are we talking about grid modernization? As Carl mentioned, there are a lot of drivers, not only social, but technological, economic drivers. So we have more and more distributed energy resources. We see solar on the houses of our neighbors that we drive through. We're hearing more and more about small battery packs that you're going to be able to have in your home and island yourself and have power during outages. Not only that, but we're also having this transformation of technology. All of us now carries what is essentially a small computer in our pockets where we can check the news, check our email, text somebody across the world. So why doesn't our grid reflect the information technology transformation that's been happening everywhere else in every other sector of our lives? So grid modernization is just that process. I hope we're on the third bullet. I can't see it back here. We're bringing digital evolution to our grid so that we can enhance the safety, reliability of our grid. We can bounce back from power outages faster, and we can really integrate energy efficiency and demand management and reward end users for being a part of a grid that is more stable and resilient. So what does it look like? This is probably the best picture we can find. On the left, you have your old grid. The first power grid was invented in 1882, I think, in New York, and it really was just a steam generating plant that delivered power to, I think, a newspaper. And now on the right, we're shifting to centralized generating plants, which are going to remain probably an essential part of our grid for the foreseeable future. But you also have people that are essentially driving large batteries around, or you have people that can turn down their air conditioning with a Wi-Fi thermostat if you ask them to. You have people who have solar on their roof where if they're not using it at their house, they can sell it back to the grid and maybe power their neighbor. Next slide, please. So why should you all care? I assume you care because you're here so early in the morning, but we're actually kind of making history here. This is really the first time that the Department of Public Utilities in Massachusetts has said, wait a minute, we have a really old grid here. What are we going to do to bring it into the 21st century? So 130 years after the first grid was invented, in 2012, DPU opened an investigation on how do we modernize our grid? How do we bring consumers into the business of not only using electricity, but producing electricity, and how can that benefit everyone on the grid? We shouldn't underestimate the fact that the choices that we make today, because this is somewhat of a historic event, are going to have dramatic impacts on distributed energy resources such as solar and storage, and on the way that we implement energy efficiency programs and how consumers can benefit for many years to come. And the last one is never a point to get lost, is you're going to pay for it. Everything the utility does is ultimately paid for by the customers of the utility. And so I was thinking about this the other day, and there really aren't that many things that you have to pay for that you don't have at least some level of choice in. Even if it's, say, taxes, you at least get to vote for your representatives that make those choices. So this is something where we have a utility that's proposing changes that everyone is going to pay for. We need to be able to have a voice in that process. And so that's why we're here this morning. That's why we want to make sure we educate people on what grid modernization is, how they can or can't benefit. So what's the goal here? The DPU set forth 4 goals in their order on grid modernization. We'll walk through them, but essentially the first one, reducing the effect of outages. And what does that mean? It's threefold. It's reducing the number of outages, it's reducing the number of people affected by outages, and it's reducing the duration of each outage. So those 3 elements combine to make, generally, we want to reduce the number of customer hours where we have outages. Want to optimize demand resources, including system and customer cost. What does that mean? Well, we now have smart technology that enables us to know real time the state of the grid. We can know real time electricity pricing. So why shouldn't customers be able to adjust the demand rather than having generators adjust the output? We want to be able to use load as a resource to help manage the stability of the grid. Third, we want to be able to integrate distributed energy resources for a variety of reasons, including policy goals. We do have aggressive, or fairly aggressive, climate change goals here in Massachusetts. It's been recognized as a legislative priority. And so the way you get to that is reducing your dependence on fossil fuels. And a big stride in that is integrating more distributed energy resources so that you are producing clean energy and you're producing it hopefully close to the source to minimize your losses. And the fourth is improving workforce and asset management, which is largely going to be essentially a byproduct of the first 3, but that gets to running an efficient grid and reducing customer costs. Next slide. So how do we get there? The DPU said, we want you to file a grid modernization plan. This needs to be a strategic planning document telling us how you are going to achieve the objectives we've set forth. And here are the required elements. You need to have a 5-year short-term investment plan, or the STIP. That's what Eversource has filed. That's primarily what we're discussing here. A marketing, education, and outreach plan, a research and development plan, proposed infrastructure and performance metrics. They want to know what you're going to do to your infrastructure, and they want to know how you're going to measure the improvements that you seek. And then lastly, and this is an important one, procedures that would allow competitive suppliers to access certain customer usage data while also protecting that customer's confidentiality. This gets to the idea that we'll talk a little bit more about later on of TVR. And as we all know, Massachusetts is a competitive market for electricity, so you can choose who you want to buy your kilowatt hours from. And so because the utility owns the meter, because the utility is the manager of that data, they need to be able to provide that to third parties so that we can have a competitive marketplace with suppliers that can offer time-varying rates, not just the utility. So next slide, please. Generally, and we'll get a little more into the details and talk about how we arrived at these generalities, Eversource filed a short-term investment plan that is generally conservative and very grid-facing and utility-centric. Could you click again, please? It emphasizes incremental investments. I think Carl touched on this. You know, they claim that they need to keep a flexible foundation for the future. And so what they're saying is, we have all these technologies, they're evolving so quickly, and we don't want to invest too much in something that we're not really sure is still going to be relevant 5 years down the road. We just want to improve our baseline and be ready to adopt new technologies. They're also heavily focused on improving reliability and resiliency. They have studies that have shown that that's what customers care about, and I think everyone in this room does care about having a reliable grid, meaning it doesn't go down very often, and a resilient grid, which means when it does go down, it can come back faster and it affects less customers. They talk about reliability and resiliency over and over again, and you'll see it when the rubber meets the road and where they're going to spend their money. It also downplays the benefits of giving customers greater access to the information and pricing transparency. Next, or if you can click again, please. This generality is most apparent through the approach they take into advanced metering functionality, AMF, and time varying rates, TVR. They essentially claim that most customers are not interested. They like getting a bill once a month. They don't want to know what prices actually are. They just want to pay a flat charge, and they're not interested in having the information at their disposal to be able to make more informed decisions about their electricity consumption and production. Next slide. So this is where they're spending the money. We're going to talk about these first three in a little more detail. Smart and integrated grid, which is where the bulk of their investment is. A resilient grid, which we'll talk about, and customer engagement. The enabling investments we're not going to delve into as much because though there are some issues there, they are the investments that are essentially going to be the baseline that are going to enable the other investments that they're proposing. So what do we come out at about $497 million for the first 5 years of this 10-year plan. So the first big category, next slide please, is a smart and integrated grid where they're proposing to spend about $172 million. So I'm going to walk a fine line here and try to explain to you what is included here without boring you to death. And I'm not a system engineer, I'm not a system planner. So if you ask me questions about the details of these things, you'd probably stump me. But they essentially, the first category, and there are 10 categories, I picked the first three, the big ticket items out of this, are advanced sensing technology. We want to spend $60 million. And what advanced sensing technology includes is things like microprocessor relays, which are located at substation transformers and allow for real-time loading data on the transformer and remote operation for fast trip, lockout settings, et cetera. So these are adaptive protections, and they claim that they are going to help them integrate more distributed energy resources that tend to have variable output that's not controlled by the utility. It also includes what's called distribution feeder supervisory control and data acquisition, or DSCADA, on a lot of different components of the grid. They're essentially taking those components and they're adding DSCADA to make them both smarter in terms of sending real-time information and also remotely operable, which has a couple benefits we'll talk about in a minute. They proposing automated feeder reconfiguration is another big chunk of this $172 million, which will essentially automatically segment line sections in the event of an outage. And the hope there is that, as we talked about, you want to reduce the number of outages, the number of customers affected, and how long the outages last for. The hope here is that you're going to reduce the number of customers affected by an outage so that when you have it, it can actually stop the outage in a segment of the line so the customers down the line won't be affected. The third big one is remote faulted circuit indication. This is along the same lines. It deploys technology in both the underground systems and the overhead systems, the difference of which we'll talk about in a minute, to automatically detect and notify Eversource of the location of the fault current, thereby reducing outage time, which is one of the three things we talked about. Next slide, please. So what are the benefits of this chunk of money that they want to spend on the smart and integrated grid? Back one. There we go. It's going to enhance their real-time awareness. What that means is right now when they have data points on the grid, primarily at substations, where they know or they have a very good idea about what the loading levels at given a time of day are. But beyond that, they have pretty limited insight into the real-time status of the grid. They have models that help them, based on statistical data of actual load. They can model what a load at a substation may look like based on customer classes, and they use that as the basis for a lot of the decisions they make, especially about investing in infrastructure and upgrades at the substation level especially, but also across the grid. So it's going to enhance the system awareness and therefore the reliability by having real-time loading data. It's also going to hopefully or maybe reduce infrastructure investments and upgrades. As Carl mentioned, utilities they have an inherent interest in investing in infrastructure because they make a return on that investment, and that's the primary mechanism for them to make money for their shareholders. So if you can have real-time loading data rather than just a good idea of what the load at a substation looks like, what the load shape is, you don't have to use as conservative safety margins when you're planning for growth needs to upgrade a substation. So if you take the real-time loading data into account, you may be able to defer a substation upgrade, or you may realize that the loading levels aren't what you thought, or you may realize they're greater than you thought, and you may need to push up that reliability measure to make sure your customers aren't going to have outages. It's important to note that system planners need to take this data into account, and actually Eversource, while in their narrative they say that they could use this to defer infrastructure upgrades or better manage their investments, they don't actually quantify it in their benefit cost analysis, which is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of what gets implemented. It's going to enhance worker safety through automation, pretty straightforward, and something that I think we would all care about. We want to make sure the workers on the lines are safe. And hopefully it's going to reduce the number of outages, the duration of outages, and number of customers affected by outages. However, what comes into play is when you have something like automated feeder reconfiguration, so that it automatically reconfigures itself to reroute the line to restore power to customers or keep customers online in the event of one segment goes down, you have to have an alternate supply route. And there are a lot of places, including a lot of the coastal areas in Massachusetts, that really don't have alternate supply routes. So I'm getting the message to speed it up a little bit. So what are our concerns? We want to make sure that the costs and the benefits are allocated appropriately. In other words, we don't want to be paying for improvements that are primarily going to benefit ratepayers off Cape, especially in the Boston corridor. Some examples, a lot of these improvements, especially the ones I just listed, are slated for underground networks that serve primarily urban areas, such as the Boston metro area. Examples, the circuit breakers, Discada-enabled pad mount, and they're listed here. I won't go through all of them, but we want to make sure that the customers that benefit from these systems are the customers that are paying for them. We want to see the cost causation there. Next slide, please. The resilient grid, we'll spend some time on. There's another large chunk of money, $150 million. Eversource's claim is, what's the good of upgrading and adding all this nice new shiny equipment to our grid if it's not reliable? You have to have a strong base on which to build on. So they have two main components to this, the underground and the overhead. The underground includes a lot of manhole inspections, damage and bolting, indication of infrastructure, monitoring and tracking of equipment, which gets to the running an efficient utility. And the overhead includes things like pole inspections and what they call enhanced tree trimming. So the benefits, next slide, are of course that we hopefully are going to reduce the number of outages, in particular increase resiliency during severe weather events. We want to enhance the customer and worker safety, and hopefully it's going to save money by increasing operational efficiency. You'll notice there's a question mark there. What are our concerns? This is a large part of the plan. It's about a third of the plan. Are we on the next slide? And nearly all of these quote investment elements, if I was talking about tree trimming, you're going, wait, doesn't a utility do that anyway, whether or not they have a modernized grid? It's because a lot of these appear to be core utility functions. This is what you do when you're a utility. You do manhole inspections, you do stray voltage testing, and a lot of them are operations and maintenance, such as, quote, enhanced tree trimming. So it's unclear that these should be included in a grid modernization plan, and it's also unclear how Eversource proposes to recover these costs. Is it going to be accelerated through a CapEx tracker, which is essentially a mechanism that allows them to recover those costs faster? Next slide. Customer engagement. This is the one we're going to spend some time on. They propose what's called a targeted opt-in time-varying rate program. So what they say is it's going to be available to all residential and small commercial customers, which make up about 95% of the customer base in terms of just numbers. And they're going to offer 2 pricing options for this time-varying rate. They're going to have a time-of-use critical peak pricing option, which gives you kind of 3 categories of time. An off-peak time where maybe your electricity costs 6 cents a kilowatt hour, and that's primarily at night. An on-peak time during the day when the loading levels are higher, that may cost you 12 cents a kilowatt hour. And then on days when it's really hot outside, everyone's got their AC on, the grid is heavily loaded, they'll call what's called a critical peak event, where your electricity price is suddenly maybe going to go up to 35 cents a kilowatt hour for everything you use during those 2 to 4 hours. What this gets at is conveying the actual costs of the electricity you're using rather than having a flat rate no matter what time of day you use it at, even if the wholesale market is much different at 1 p.m. than it is at 1 a.m. They also offer a targeted time of use, which essentially cuts out the critical peak, and you have one set of on-peak hours and one set of off-peak hours that better reflect the movement of the wholesale market. So the benefits of this opt-in approach, this targeted TVR program, is that there's going to be lower infrastructure costs relative to an actual full advanced metering infrastructure deployment that would be necessary for an opt-out program. And it also eliminates any risk of confusion, of negative impacts on customers that aren't aware of the switch for whatever reason, and especially low-income customers, which are always a concern when you talk about rate design. Next slide. But there are several concerns with this approach that we take. First off, it's an opt-in program, and if you opt in, what Eversource is proposing is that you, the single customer that wants to opt in, is going to have to bear extra costs. You're going to have to bear the cost possibly for the meter, though it's unclear, and you will have to bear the cost for the cellular charges to transmit that data in real time so you actually know what you're using and your usage can be billed appropriately according to the time that you use it. So it's essentially almost like having another cell phone bill every month. So it's a little unclear exactly which cost, but they have specifically said we are proposing to recover cellular costs from customers. If you want to be on a TVR, you have to switch back to basic service. You can't have a competitive supplier in our competitive supply marketplace. You can't be on a community aggregation. You have to go back to the utilities service offering, which quite frankly is a little contrary to the Restructuring Act and the idea of a competitive marketplace. And if you do select it, you have to stay on that rate for a year. So you can't, jump in for a month, try it out. If you don't like it, you get to go back to your flat rate. You're stuck on it for a year, and that's going to really make a lot of people think twice about whether or not they do want to switch back to basic service, or if they're on basic service, they're going to want to switch to a TVR to try this out, because if you don't like it, you're still locked in. As we mentioned, you must be on basic service to participate. It makes it unavailable to customers participating in the competitive markets. And importantly, it doesn't even address, as the DPU mandated that it do, to how to allow competitive suppliers access to the data so that they can offer a TVR options. So for these reasons, this TVR approach, while Eversource claims that there are benefits in terms of lowering customer confusion and lower infrastructure costs, in reality, they expect to have a low opt-in rate, and that's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you make it so difficult to participate, you are more likely to have a low opt-in rate. If you have a low opt-in rate, it doesn't make any sense to build out lots and lots of infrastructure necessary for AMI. So it's really the approach that you take, opt-in, opt-out, determines or has a large part in determining how cost-effective it is to implement TVR, which the DPU mandated be done. So in summary, next slide, the benefits, essentially Eversource is going to know how to operate their grid better. They're going to do the same thing. They're going to be able to do it a lot better. They're going to have real-time loading data. They're going to know the state of the system. They may be able to take that into account when looking at their infrastructure upgrades, which of course everyone that pays a bill pays for. And it's going to improve the reliability and resiliency of the grid. That's very heavily focused on that. There's going to be less customer outages, shorter outages, less customers affected. What they call it is a customer minute saved. So the concerns, though, is that this is a very utility-facing plan. And as Carl mentioned, there may be a little bit of gold plating in that they've given us this plan that says we're going to do all these great things to our system and the customers are going to benefit. But when you read into it, actually what it is they are going to give their system operators greater insight into the status of their grid. They're not really giving customers any insight into the grid. So it's very utility-centered. It's what we call grid-facing rather than really customer-facing. No universal advanced metering infrastructure means limited customer engagement. I think we saw that pretty clearly on Carl's slide. Even though the meter itself is not very exciting looking, it's not very attractive, it's what it enables the customer to be able to do and the information it gives the customer to make choices about their energy production and consumption. We want to make sure that, as I mentioned, the costs are allocated according to who's benefiting. Here on the Cape, we don't really want to pay for Boston improvements. We're a little concerned about the inclusion of what appears to be core utility functions. We're going to be asking Eversource why these are appropriate as an incremental investment in a grid modernization plan rather than what you do when you're a utility. It limits the opportunity for smart metering. As we mentioned, you're going to have to opt in, you're going to have to bear extra costs, and I can tell you I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't pay the extra cost to be on a TVR. It really just doesn't appear to meet the DPU guidelines for a lot of it, especially the TVR program, and their lack of providing data to third parties. The DPU said you have to do XXX, and Eversource essentially said, here's what we want to do, and here's what we're submitting. So next slide. Where we are right now is the procedural schedule has been issued for the grid modernization dockets. The DPU has issued a interlocutory order about the scope of the proceeding because originally all the utilities said in relation to DER, especially net metering, we need new rate designs to better allocate the cost of net metering, or excuse me, the cost of distributed generation. DPU said we're not discussing that here. This is a grid modernization plan, not a rate design case. The compact is participating in the Eversource docket. We are a participant. We can file briefs. We can sponsor witness testimony. We can cross-examine so that we can actually have a voice in how this is going to play out at the DPU level. And myself, our consultants, and our council are developing information requests to submit to Eversource, and Eversource then has to respond to these information requests to inform the compact's position on these issues of concern we just talked about. So the next steps, next slide, we want to continue to get information from Eversource through these information requests. We want to continue to do what we're doing here today, though hopefully with better technology, to continue to inform and engage stakeholders on these issues of concern. And we want to develop positions based on the information received both from Eversource and also from the stakeholders. We want to, as I mentioned, everyone here is going to pay for it. And so everyone here should have some voice in what they're going to be paying for and what their grid is going to look like. So we want to, because we are a participant, we can have a voice. The Cape can have a voice. There are actually only eight full interveners in this docket, and the compact is one of them. And we're the only organization that is Cape-based, the only organization that is exclusively looking out for the interest of the Cape ratepayers, rather than the Attorney General, who looks out for everyone in Massachusetts, or environmental groups who have specific interests related to the plan. So that's why we're here. Thank you for coming. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Bert so that we can take questions, have some discussion. And we'll take questions on Carl's too, I think.
Great information from Carl and Austin.